I returned from Israel this week, and on Wednesday morning, I had the privilege of being in conversation with former Duke visiting professor and now Israel's Minister of Diaspora Affairs, Nachman Shai. While on the plane, I attempted reading the executive summary of the Amnesty International report, which labeled Israel an apartheid state. Israel is on my mind. So while I don't typically take Shabbat morning to discuss headlines, you are all very well read. This is a well-read congregation, you should know, and can form your own opinions. Israel is an inescapable part of Jewish identity in the modern world. And Amnesty International is one of the world's preeminent human rights organizations. And so the issuing of the report is an important moment that I want to reflect upon. The report is not fair. That Amnesty International chose the eve of the Olympics in China not to focus on actual events of genocide, which are taking place right now against the Uyghurs, not to focus on 1 million Muslims who are in literal concentration camps at this very moment, but rather to issue this report about Israel is not fair and a moral failing. I did not read all 200 pages of the report, but the parts that I did read, and from what I understand, it offers little to no context about Israel's legitimate security challenges. The report demonizes. More gravely, the report labels apartheid not just the occupation of the West Bank since 1967, but all of Israel since its founding in 1947. Lumping together the plight of Palestinians in the West Bank as the same as Palestinians or the Arab-Israeli population living within the Green Line. And I want you to understand, even Amnesty's own representative in Jerusalem, Molly Melikar, publicly challenged the report that her organization issued, saying it, quote, obfuscates the work by humanitarian activists in the country who are deserving of recognition. And the report prevents dialogue. She said in the report that Arab Israelis who identify as Palestinians are, quote, are treated as perpetual passive victims of apartheid, devoid of any rights and agency. The report turns them into victims, into an object. This is neither truthful nor helpful. There is discrimination against Palestinian citizens of Israel, she goes on to say, but they have rights. Some in key positions they are campaigning and influencing, and this should be recognized, appreciated, and encouraged. Please don't get me wrong. There are deep injustices and disparities between Jewish and Arab populations who live inside the Green Line. There is inadequate infrastructure. There are terrible problems with policing, to name just a couple. But the report gives no credence to a fundamental difference, which is that Israeli Arabs have always had representation in the Knesset, in Israel's parliament. An Israeli Arab party is, for the first time this year, part of the governing coalition. An Israeli Arab in the last week or so, and by the way, a Mizrahi woman, also for the first time, was just appointed to Israel's Supreme Court. And many other Israeli Arabs have achieved higher education, standards of living, and opportunity in modern Israel, and to elide those distinctions is a lie. And it undermines Amnesty International's credibility moral credibility. With all that said, what is also true is that too often Jewish organizations respond to criticisms, moral criticisms of Israel by touting Israel's achievements in medicine, technology, its commitment to LGBTQ rights, and those achievements are real and they're a distraction. They fail to take seriously the many people, Jewish in our community and not Jewish, people of good conscience who have serious moral concerns about Israel's treatment of Palestinians over the Green Line. And too often raising those concerns is labeled as disloyal and anti-Semitic. And it is not. And when we use that language carelessly as a community, we alienate too many people in our community, especially the next generation. And we diminish our own ability to be taken seriously when true anti-Semitism must be confronted. As you know, I am currently in the 7th cohort of the Rabbinic Leadership Institute of the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. Yehuda Kurtzer, the president of the Shalom Hartman Institute North America, recently had a podcast with a Times of Israel journalist, Haviv Gur. This podcast was entitled Hilltop Youth and Jewish Terrorism, about attacks on people and property against Palestinians and against Israelis who were involved in nonviolent protests against those attacks. The incidents often, very often, proceed uninterrupted and then unprosecuted by the Israeli military, which in turn lends some of Israel's critics the ammunition to argue that it's actually tacitly approved of by the state. Gore describes how the army seems to willingly avoid tracking how many such attacks occur. And he discusses how there is no legal protection and little will within even this current government or the security cabinet to control these attacks because those Palestinians have no representation. Beyond these attacks, Israel's future as a Jewish and democratic state depends on limiting the growth of settlements so as to preserve the possibility of a future Palestinian state. The deeper tragedy of the Amnesty report is that rather than engaging in responsible, loving criticism of Israel's faults and suggesting real policies that actually improve the lives of Palestinians, it engages in biased name-calling that blunts true progress. We can't do much about that, but we as a community can do better. I think that expressing moral outrage at Amnesty's bias is appropriate, but I also think that we need to listen to those in and out of our community who raise moral concerns about Israel. We can and we should insist that those concerns be raised in a responsible way. But we also have to make sure that when those concerns are raised, those people who are expressing them are not demonized or ostracized. In a week when thousands of Ukrainian Jews are once again fleeing for their lives and the state of Israel is mobilizing to save them, I am again grateful for the state of Israel. A modern nation state is able to protect Jews around the world and help many others as well, and do lots of things that American Jews and other diaspora communities of Jews cannot and will never be able to do. As Foreign Minister Yair Lapid said 2 weeks ago, I'm looking at Ukraine and saying, thank God for the IDF and our ability to defend ourselves. But Rabbi David Hartman, for whom the Shalom Hartman Institute, or by whom it was founded, described Zionism as a challenge to responsibility. Justice is at the heart, tzedakah u'mishpat, of the Jewish covenant with God. I can't go a sermon without quoting the Kli Yakar, so here it is. He writes this week about how before any material was donated for the Mishkan, Moses would sit in judgment and make sure so that it was absolutely clear that any material that was donated to the Mishkan had been acquired justly and given freely. Justice is at the heart of how we bring God's presence into the world and into our midst. And that means wrestling with and taking seriously what Yehuda Kurtzer calls Zionism's heart of darkness. Zionism, he goes on to say, was the opening for the Jewish people to pursue a process of self-determination. And that translated quickly into the need for sovereignty and access to power. He says, I think that's a good thing, but since 1948, and especially in 1967, there's no way to talk about sovereignty or power without talking about Palestinians, those over whom Israel is sovereign, and those whom against Israel exercises state power. What happens when this kind of violence becomes so common that it's banal? When we are forced to question our assumptions about what aspects of sovereignty and power are necessary and which aspects of it are irredeemably corrupting. Kurtzer's questions, those questions are Jewish questions. And the future of our connection with Israel and our connection as a people with each other may very well depend on our ability to let them be asked and answered. Shabbat Shalom.